The line through the hole in the dark vestibule ceiling ended in a powerful knot, worn slick, swinging in the breeze from those passing. Half an hour before service, Uncle Allen pulled the call to worship, hauling down the rope like the starting cord of a motor, and the tower answered and answered, fading as the clapper lolled aside. I watched him, before Sunday school, heave on the line as on a well rope, and the wheel creaked up there as heavy buckets emptied out their startle and spread a cold splash to the farthest coves and hollows, then sucked the rope back into the loft, leaving just the knot within reach, trembling with its high connections. I met at Chapel Hill when I was undergraduate, two writers named Russell Banks and William Matthews. They became famous writers, novelist and poet respectively. And they started a magazine called Little Bolero. They published my poems in every issue of that magazine. And it was a little magazine with no wide circulation, maybe 500 copies of each issue, but it got out to the right people. So that by the time I was 23 and 24, I was being read by other editors and getting letters from editors saying, I saw your poems in Little Bolero. Would you send us some poems? That's a very heady experience for a young writer. Matthews got a job teaching at Cornell, and he invited me to come and read poems at Cornell in the fall of 1970. We drove up there. My mother-in-law lived in Syracuse, just outside Syracuse, so we made it a family visit as well as a business trip. I read, and apparently it was well received. So the next spring, I got a letter inviting me to come and teach for a year to replace a poet who was going on sabbatical. I went up to Cornell, had never lived in the North before, expecting to be back in Henderson County the next spring. But things went well. I seemed somehow connected with the other faculty, with the students. And they invited me to stay another year. And then in the spring of 1973, the chair called me into his office and said, would you like to be a professor? So I have been there ever since, really. They promoted me so fast and so high, I wasn't able to get away from Cornell, but it was a place that was very congenial to me. It's a great university for a poet. It's a great ag school, a great engineering school. Or as I once said, you have on this campus world-famous scholars of weeds and of stars. What more could a poet want? I was born in 1944. And I remember the era just after World War II. And the boys who had just come home, people would wear parts of their uniforms, and people were buying Army surplus Jeeps. I can remember seeing Jeeps plowing in fields. But I feel as though I have a foot in the 19th century and one in the 21st century, because the Green River Valley, when I was a little kid, was still very much the way it had been earlier in the 20th century and even in the 19th century. We plowed with a horse. We did not have a car or truck or tractor. So I lived in a world of subsistence farming, essentially. We had chickens and kept hogs and cows and grew our own vegetables, got out and picked berries in the summertime and gathered nuts in the fall, that sort of thing. So I feel as though I have a connection almost to the pioneer world. But that world began to change rapidly in the 1950s. The GE plant came in 1955. And suddenly people had jobs in industry. They were making more money. They weren't living on what they grew on their farms. And of course, tourism began to grow and retirees began moving in. Real estate prices began going up. By the time I left here to go to college in 1961, it was already changing toward the kind of world we have now. More golf courses, retirement centers, that sort of thing. I think there were tremendous advantages as well as disadvantages in growing up here. I grew up among wonderful storytellers. We didn't have a television. We sat around and talked with a fireplace in the winter or on the porch in summer. I heard all these wonderful stories about panthers and mad dogs and snakes and ghosts. And my dad, who loved history, would talk about the Revolution and the Civil War, the Cherokee Indians. He had lots of stories about the family, about what our ancestors had done, where they came from. My mother loved to tell stories, particularly about witches and all kinds of portents and babies that had been marked in the womb, that kind of thing. But also, I believe that I had a particular perspective on the modern world coming into it from something somewhat different. It's been pointed out by many scholars that most writers are, in one way or another, outsiders. That writing is very rarely done really by insiders or people in power. It's the person who comes from outside and gets to know a culture who often writes best about it. And I think that coming to the university, say from the Blue Ridge Mountains, gave me a particular perspective on the world of education, of intellectual tradition and that kind of thing. Something else that should be said is that I grew up among people who read the Bible constantly, talked about the Bible, argued about the Bible, and I was exposed to a kind of scholarly approach, even though I was far from any major universities or anything. I was very familiar with the techniques of hermeneutics and the way you go to a text to construct an argument and connect history to religious belief, or the history of ideas. That stood me in good stead later. I grew up among people who could argue forever about the interpretation of the book of Revelation, for instance. Was this passage foretelling Hitler or Stalin, or when was the end of the world coming? And invariably preachers and my dad and my grandpa said the end of the world was coming in the 20th century. It might come at any moment. The Russians might blow us up any moment. As time passed and it didn't happen, I began to realize that just because people said things, they weren't necessarily so. Well, I think all my family members have influenced me. My mother was the sort of person who liked to notice things, with the flowers, where the birds were putting their nests, the details of the weather. She was a close observer, and that, I think, had a deep influence on me. Still does. I think my dad would have been a writer had he had the right education, because he loved to read, he loved words, he loved to talk. He could talk for hours. He could keep you spellbound with his stories. I think he had a deep influence on me, not only in the sense of language. I had a model of language there, somebody who really knew how to use language, but his interest in history. He had a wonderful sense of the stream of time, of where things fit, and of synchronous things, what's happening here, what's happening there, which is very important. And so many people lack that. They don't have a sense of history. They don't have a sense of when things happen, or of the sequence, the chain of events, the cause and effect. Of course, history is a narrative. We create a narrative out of certain facts and make sense of history by creating a story and shading it and shaping it. The idea was you had to go off to engineering school and make rockets to beat the Russians. Sputnik had just gone up in 57. I was a farm boy. I loved science. But what really seduced me into aerospace engineering and applied mathematics was a math teacher at Emory. I went off to Emory when I was 16. I had not been a particularly good student of mathematics. I took a class with a man who had taught at West Point for many years and who understood the logic and philosophy of mathematics. He could tell you what a function was. He could describe spaces and numbers. And he made it so easy that I discovered, much to my surprise, that I was the best in the class. They put me in an accelerated class where I did analytical geometry, trigonometry, and college algebra in one short quarter and introductory calculus. And he made it so logical and so easy that I made an A, I was the best in the class, and I moved on to calculus. I decided I would use that ability in rocket science, aerospace engineering. Applied to NC State, was given a scholarship, and transferred to NC State at the age of 17 to study aerospace engineering and mathematics. Was having a wonderful time. It was going well. Raleigh was an exciting place in the early 60s. There were lots of movies and concerts, lots of visiting writers. Two things I'll mention that happened that turned me away. In the fall of 1962, the poet Howard Nemeroff came to NC State and gave a reading. I had never been to a poetry reading. Nemeroff was this tall, slim man with short gray hair who read in this resonant voice that was so rich and controlled, and he read poems in an idiom I had never heard, that is contemporary American speech, but the poems were of great formal precision. And that was something of a revelation. I didn't realize you could do that. I mean, I knew the poems of Carl Sandburg and the poems of Frost a little bit, and even the poems of Whitman and Stevens, but I had not ever heard a contemporary poet. That set me to thinking about what is poetry? I mean, can you make poetry out of ordinary speech? Can you make poetry out of ordinary things? And there apparently was an example of somebody who could do that. He could raise just humble facts and ordinary speech to the level of art. Well, for a peculiar reason, I was denied an advanced course in partial differential equations. I wanted to accelerate and take a much more advanced class. My advisor said, I know you're qualified to do this, you could do it, but you never graduated from high school and you never made up your deficiency in solid geometry, therefore I'm going to hold you back. I realized that in the time slot that course was scheduled, I could take Intro Creative Writing, English 222, taught by Guy Owen, the novelist. I signed up for that, and it was just so wonderful. It was maybe my first English class, because I had been excused from taking English at Emory for some reason. I guess I passed the test and didn't have to take freshman comp. But Guy Owen said things the first day of that class I'm still passing on the students. He said, learn the names of things, be precise. Don't say tree, say oak tree. Better still, say chestnut oak or Spanish oak. He said, listen to the way people talk. Learn the inflections of speech so that you can give your characters a living voice. And those are extremely important bits of advice. About a month into that class, I wrote a story about my great-grandmother, Delia Johnson Capps, who lived into her 90s. She could remember the Civil War. I actually knew somebody who could remember the Civil War. When she was a little kid, she had been taken out of Henderson County, out of the mountains, which were overrun by outlaws, down to Walterboro, South Carolina, to be safe. And they were safe until Sherman got to Savannah and turned north. And he just obliterated that part of South Carolina. She could remember bodies being carried and heaped on the porch and dogs climbing up on that heap of bodies. Told us that story. I wrote a little story about it. Guy Owen brought it into the class and said, I wept when I read this story. Well, none of my math teachers had said that to me. And I began to get hooked on this writing thing. it just seemed somehow what I wanted to do. So that I began to forget about mechanics and physics and electronics and math, and to think more and more about language, about how you get rid of cliches, how you learn to write economically, how you learn to rewrite. I transferred to UNC Chapel Hill. I was afraid to leave math completely, so I transferred in pure math and did several courses in pure mathematics at Chapel Hill, but my heart was not in it. I was going to see movies. This was such an exciting time. All the Italian movies of Fellini, all the Scandinavian movies of Bergman were being shown, the angry young man movies. I'd never seen a movie in a theater until I went off to college, but I started making up for it. I hadn't seen very much television either, very little television. But I took courses in art history, I took courses in French, and I met a group of people at Chapel Hill, mostly from the Northeast, who had come to Chapel Hill to be writers. I learned as much or more from them as I did from the teachers in the classes, because they were people who could talk about Baudelaire and Mallarmé, they could talk about metaphor and simile, they could talk about William Butler Yeats and Robert Lowell, and I began to really acquire an education in poetry, though my main interest was in fiction writing. I started writing poetry, and it was recognized so quickly by publication, by fellowships. By the time I was 23 or 24, I was publishing in national magazines. So, though I had started out to study engineering, and then I wanted more than anything to be a fiction writer, I found myself in graduate school and primarily writing poetry. I had to do a lot of hard work when I was very young, actually. Working in bean fields, hoeing corn. When I was very young, I learned to plow with a horse, saw wood with a crosscut saw, chop it with an axe, split wood. I just wanted to escape it then. I escaped it into reading, into music, fantasizing, going off to college. So I was amazed when I got older and began to write that I went back to work. I discovered that work was one of my main subjects. And that makes sense because as I got older, I realized that it is our work that defines us. It's not our recreational activities. Our greatest satisfaction comes from our work, comes from the struggle to do a good job, and doing a job well is just about the best thing that we know. The French have a saying that work is the ultimate opium. And the French always get it right. But I love to describe how people do work, how they grow corn or beans, how you build a house, how you do masonry, how you repair something, how you build something. I love to describe technique, whether it's fishing or trapping muskrats. And I think that has factored into my work a lot. I love to describe how things are accomplished. And though I, when I was young, tried to escape work, I guess the work of my life has been going back and describing how it's done. And of course, it's easier to write about it than to actually do it. But I discovered early on I was a language person. I love to work with language, that my medium was words, finding the textures, the right combinations, succinctness, precision of diction. And I enjoy that the way a carpenter loves to work with wood, to make the joints exactly right, to get the house upright, foursquare, sound. So there is the work with words, which is play, really. I've been lucky. My play is my work. Well, certainly the family poems, the poems about my father. I have a number of poems about my father. For instance, he loved to mow. He was almost a compulsive mower. And I've written a poem about that. He loved to work out in the rain. He loved to work in solitude. He didn't like to work with other people. And I've written a number of poems about his work, about his personality. Probably the most personal, the most emotional is a poem called The Gift of Tongues, about him speaking in tongues at Pentecostal services. I was raised in the Baptist church and to some extent Pentecostal holiness. I could not write about that until I was about 40. It was such an intense thing and so scary. I realized later that glossolalia, speaking in tongues, is so scary because it's language out of control. It's like total inspiration, a secret language, a higher language, I say. And writers are interested in inspiration and spontaneity, but also control. You've got to have both. Language out of control is, in a sense, no language at all. Though you want to get close to that irrational energy. Emerson, in his great poem, Bacchus, talking about the drunkenness of inspiration, says, "And I hear far chaos talk with me." Emerson understood this very well. He has two poems that go together. Merlin, the poem about wisdom and philosophy. Bacchus, the poem about inspiration and drunkenness. Guess which is the better poem? A summer-long ritual for my father. Half dancing and half rowing into a weed bank. He gripped the handles of the snath and swung, beginning high and back and followed through, running the blade true to the ground, and then up to winnow away the cut ends. Snakes and field mice and my mother's flowers got beheaded in his rage to mow. Pokeweeds, briars around the pasture were subdued to his measure. He even cut the shoulders of the public road, exposing beer cans and bags of trash. And once each season cleaned off the churchyard and cemetery acre. Mowing met his first requirements, solitude and no monetary gain. As he swung, he must have seen the heads of neighbors, deacons, wife and son topple and the stubble bleed for their intrusion on his long reverie. That blade, a wide wing of metal, tempered in Czechoslovakia, soared around and back, making its deadly time, regular as a pendulum, touching its flame with a hiss to the green stampede. But there was no end, except frost to the siege of tender growth. Suddenly he'd stop, and holding the scythe upright, take the stone from his hip pocket and whet the blade brilliant, spit on his hands, and return to the lone moor. I see him there now, wading in rampant vines, turning quick as a matador in overalls and wrecked hat, reaching back with his instrument to let the next wave of summer plunge past and wilt. There's so many writers who've influenced me. It would take a long time to... But when I really started reading, when the bookmobile started coming, I first fell in love with Jack London and James Oliver Curwood and those great adventure stories set in the Arctic, in the Yukon, the Klondike, Northwest Territories. Then I discovered Dickens and just read ceaselessly Oliver Twist, David Copperfield. But it was a big moment when I discovered Look Homeward Angel. And like every 15-year-old, I just fell in love with that book and thought it was the greatest book ever written, and that I was Eugene Gant and his family were my family, sort of thing. And it was probably Woolf who first gave me the idea that maybe I could be a writer. If he could write a book and set it in Asheville and sell it in New York, maybe I could do something similar. But much later, I realized that the writer in that period who had the greatest influence on the way I would write was Hemingway. Because soon after reading Woolf and Tolstoy, I discovered Hemingway. And Hemingway's ideal of writing is not so much the actual writing that Hemingway did, as his idea of what good writing was: succinct, economical, indirect, implicit. Hemingway says the best dialogue reveals what is not said, that sort of thing. And it was that ideal that I carried with me. It wasn't Southern writers with their rhetorical flourishes, Faulkner and Thomas Wolfe, Flannery O'Connor, who influenced me. It was much more Hemingway. But I must say that just before I went off to college, after studying with Julia Lapin and Mrs. Rogers, I discovered Dr. Zhivago. It was all in the news then. And I think that book had an enormous influence on me, looking back. I mean, not only is it a sweeping, romance, it's a deeply philosophical book. And among the subjects discussed is poetry. There's a lot of talk about poetry, the nature of poetry. And I did not realize, I think, how much I was absorbing of Pasternak's ideals of what poetry was, the way it dealt with everyday life, the way it dealt with humble things. And then, of course, there are the great poems at the end of Dr. Zhivago, these lofty religious poems and philosophical poems. I probably absorbed from that the idea that the same writer could be a prose writer and a poet. And here the greatest Russian poet of the 20th century wrote this great novel. Imperfect, it's a flawed novel, but it's an unforgettable piece of writing. Later, as I began to write more and more poetry, other writers were very important. In high school, I discovered Walt Whitman. In my sister's textbook she brought back from Bob Jones University. And in the same textbook, I turned to somebody named Wallace Stevens and discovered a little poem called Domination of Black, about the cry of the peacocks and the hemlocks, and seeing the leaves spin and the fire spin, and looking out the window and seeing the planets spin. And I thought, that's so wonderful. You look at something close up, and you look at something far away, and you see the connection between them. Leaves and fire, and the cry of the peacocks, and the color of the hemlocks. That was a really important poem for me. I also read 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, and never forgot it. Here was somebody who could write a line, among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of a blackbird. Again, that contrast of the far and near, the huge and the tiny. Stevens is awfully good at that. He even calls a poem "The Planet on the Table," that sort of thing. The art of far and near, the way you move between the two. So Stevens is probably much more important than anybody has recognized, because my poetry sounds so different. It looks different in many ways, but I think I learned a lot from Stevens. I'm still learning from him. There's poetry that has virtually no images, the poetry of abstraction, philosophical poetry. Or Stevens says the poem must be abstract, or it must be abstract. The supreme fiction must be abstract. And of course Stevens is deeply conflicted about that, because he loves the poetry of sensation, the poetry of senses, and the poetry of the mind. The greatest poets can write poetry of almost straight abstraction. Shakespeare in passages, Herbert, for instance, Emily Dickinson can begin a poem, "Beauty be not caused, it is. Chase it and it ceases. Chase it not and it abides." And the power of the poetry there, the objective correlative, shall we say, is in the sound, it's in the language itself. Our poetry can be very sensuous, but great poetry has both. It has imagery, a metaphor, detail, sensation, abstraction, thought, and I wouldn't want a poetry that didn't have both. You can see a great philosophical poet like Stevens moving back and forth. The energy of poetry is in the movement between the specific and the general, the abstract and the specific, or to put it in Latin terms, between quiddity and haexiety, the thisness and the whatness. What is it? This is a particular image. Hopkins was obsessed with that. something he had gotten out of Scotus, and he fell in love with the poetry of haexiety, the poetry of thisness, the particular detail, the individual, individuation, hypostasis, philosophers call it. But the energy in poetry is the movement between the universal and the concrete, the general and the particular. When you're writing poems, you usually wait until you have an idea. It could be a sound, a line, a metric, usually an image, a metaphor, a connection. As you write more and more, you begin to see what your subjects are, and you recognize there's a certain life, a certain resonance in an idea, and you sit down and you just try to write it out. You take the risk of failing, of making a fool of yourself. Every time you sit down to write, you can write just as badly as you did when you started out. So you have to be a risk taker. You have to be willing to make mistakes, and then to see their mistakes and clean it up and change it and revise it. But I discovered, because I was teaching full-time and helping to raise 3 children, that I had to have a time to write. And I learned as long ago as 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, to get up early before anybody was up, before the television was on, and write for a little while, an hour, 2 hours, sometimes 3. And then I would give the rest of the day to the business I had to do, to teaching, to getting ready for classes, going over to Cornell. I once said to the chair at Cornell, after I've had my 2 hours writing, Cornell can have the rest. But if you work 2 hours a day, you can get a lot done, as it turns out. It really does mount up. If you write a page a day, that's 365 pages in a year. So being consistent, and after a while you realize that this is the thing you enjoy most. That writing is to you what running is to runners. The best high you get is from immersing yourself in your fictive world or in your poems and working on them. And the greatest satisfaction is the sense that it went well. You did something. You made a discovery. You pushed it farther. You deepened the character. You discovered something about the world, these characters, and that you can go on. Tomorrow you're going to write some more. Hemingway said, always stop where you know you can go forward when you come back to it. And I tend to work when I'm traveling. Hotel rooms are very good places to work, motel rooms. As you put in an hour or 2 on your story, re-immerse yourself in the Blue Ridge Mountains in 1910, say. And then you're revved up and ready to go out and do the interview or the bookstore reading or whatever. Well, my first publications were short stories, and I wanted to be a short story writer. But I always wanted to be a novelist. In the back of my mind, at every point in my life, I wanted to, because I thought the novel was the great form of modern literature. That other ages have been the ages of poetry or ages of drama, ages of epic. But I was never able to finish a novel. I started many of them. I wrote sections of them. It took me a long time to begin to acquire something of the art of narrative. In 1980, when I was 35, I started writing prose. And there were 2 reasons I wanted to write prose. One was I wanted to write in voices other than my own, which I hadn't been able to do very much in poetry. I also wanted to tell some of the stories I had heard about the panthers and snakes and mad dogs and the Civil War and the Revolution, and I hadn't been able to do as much of that in poetry as I'd wanted. I wanted to write in a more popular form. I figured I'm a sort of ordinary person and I should be writing for, more ordinary people, that poetry has a kind of elite audience, a highly literate audience for the most part. So it was partly that, a sense of wanting to reach out. It was also, I was reaching out for a different sense of space. That when you're working on poetry, you're thinking in terms of line break, and cadence, and repetition, metrics sometimes, syllabics sometimes. But writing prose, your sense of space is very different and much larger. Your sense of space as a prose writer is emotional space, fictive space. You're creating a space where there's weather and where things are happening and where there's a background and a foreground, where there are people experiencing things, emotions, fear, anger. And part of the thrill of writing fiction for me was that stretching out into this much larger space. You're peeling back the edges and peeling them back and peeling them back and reaching out through voice. It took me 6 years to write short stories good enough to publish. I say if there's hope for me, there's hope for anybody. I started publishing stories in 1987. And that built up my confidence a lot. If one editor would publish a story, maybe others would. Published a little book of stories in 1989. Probably my most important year as a fiction writer. A little book called The Blue Valleys came out. It got more reviews in the first month than all my books of poetry previously had put together. It got a rave in the New York Times, a brief review, but an absolute rave. The New York Times had never noticed me before that. And at the same time, I made the greatest breakthrough I've ever made as a writer. I've done an enormous amount of research on World War II Air Force, B-17s, East Anglia, 8th Air Force. I had studied my uncle's life. He was killed in a B-17 crash in November of 1943. I interviewed pilots and co-pilots, bombardiers, navigators, waist gunners, tail gunners. I interviewed people who had known him. I interviewed somebody who saw the crash. I studied the history of strategic bombing, and I knew all the flight paths into Germany you would take from East Anglia. But I couldn't get started on that novel. I was so overwhelmed by the technical details. And one day, in frustration, I thought, if I can't get started anyway, I might as well try something else. Why not dream up a fiancé for this soldier and let her tell part of the story? And it was so scary to think of being a writer, of telling your story from the point of view of a woman. What would I know about how this woman would tell a story, think, remember, feel about things? But I said, I will be like an actor. I will immerse myself, I will erase myself to get into this character and just try to imagine how she would feel, remember seeing her fiancé off, how she felt when she got the telegram, what she did. Suddenly I began to visualize this woman in her 70s in a nursing home in Henderson County. She has lost a foot, she's going through physical therapy, and she's remembering 1941, 1942, and she describes doing the research I had done, and I felt I had the voice. And from that point on, it was like she was writing the story for me. By the time I had 30 pages, I knew it was the best thing I'd ever written. And I discovered the most important thing to know about fiction writing. It is not autobiography. Fiction writing is about your characters and their world, their voices, their feelings, their memories. And once you escape yourself into the imagination, you're getting somewhere as a writer. And that is the most important thing I've probably ever discovered about writing. Young writers tend to want autobiography. They believe that that gives writing an authenticity, that is, it really happened to them. This is the way it was. You've got to escape that into the imagination and let the imagination take over, the logic of the imagination. In writing fiction, you start with nothing. You start with a blank sheet of paper, a blank computer screen, and you create a sense of reality, one sentence, one detail, one act at a time. You do not try to transfer actual experience to the page. When you do that, you leave out the most important things because after all, it really happened. But when you're imagining it, you imagine the significant details, the important things to make it real to the reader. Eudora Welty says, near the end of one writer's beginning, we sometimes create our best characters by accident, but most often by going farthest from ourselves. So the imagination has to take over, and we're not trying to transcribe actual events. Surprise. You never have a good story if you can see where it's going and it just goes there. It has to seem to be going here and then it goes there. And the best stories keep surprising us. They reward us sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. They engage us in any number of ways. One, with conflict. There's something at stake. If somebody says, I was robbed and I saw the fellow, running away and I ran after him, you're going to listen to find out what happened there. So conflict is very important. All good stories are about struggle of one sort or another, never static. The best definition I ever heard of narrative was from a teacher at Chapel Hill who said, you got a story when you got somebody who wants something real bad and it's hard to get. I don't care if it's $1 million in the bank or a blonde down the street or they're in jail and they want to get out of it. It's the wanting it real bad and the difficulty of getting it that makes the story. There are two sides to this. Some critics say that men prefer stories of conflict and women prefer stories of connection. All great stories have both. You're not going to be a very good writer if you don't have that sense of human connection. That's the epiphany, the insight into character, the sense of making contact with people. Because we read stories and we write stories to reach other people, to share lives, to have a sense of community. Eudora Welty said a novel is an extended intimacy between strangers. Is that when you read about somebody in a novel, you get to know them. The novel is about their life, their community, their family, their struggle. And the very special thing about modern fiction is its intimacy. It's a kind of intimacy you don't have in literature before that. That the novels of Fielding, the novels of Defoe, the novels of Richardson are about the minute details of lives and their emotions and the family relationships and about sexuality and politics. And you just have this wonderfully vivid portrait of a world in a novel in great detail. But there are always people who are in trouble, notice that. You can't make a novel or a good story out of somebody where everything happens is good. Or I tell students, you find the story first by finding the pain. You go where it hurts. And there's where the story is. That your mother may have told you to not say anything unless you could say something good. That won't help you as a fiction writer. You go for the dirt. You go for the humiliation. You go for the hurt, the sense of alienation. And the story is about how somebody deals with that. The model is the detective story. Somebody's been killed or somebody's been robbed. And how is that solved? In most fiction, somebody has been hurt. Somebody's lost something. They've lost their way. They're far from home and they're trying to find their way home. That's the truly classic story, the person who's lost, Odysseus. The story of Coal Mountain. And how do you get home? We're always interested in that, the quest for home. Somebody once said to me, when did writing become so violent? When did storytelling become so violent? And I was not trying to be smart, I thought, and I said, well, I think it began with the Iliad, which is still the bloodiest story there is. I never set out to write about Henderson County or the mountains as such. I just discovered that the stories I wanted to tell were mostly set there. Of course, we tend to write better, especially when we're young, about a world we know something about. We may write better about characters very different from us, but it's hard to create a new world and new characters. But I found I had stories I wanted to tell and poems I wanted to write, and then I was going to write about other things, but I have not been able to exhaust it. There's so many stories I want to tell about this region and the history of this region. But I do want to write more stories set in upstate New York. about the revolution there and the Indians there and the things that have happened in the Finger Lakes, upstate New York. But I don't know. I think writers feel they're given subjects. You don't choose a subject, it chooses you. Characters choose you. To some extent, particularly as a fiction writer, you're pretty helpless, that you are the creation of your fictions more than they're created by you. When a character takes hold in a story, it's as though the character writes the story. I was told by the novelist Alison Lurie when I first began writing fiction, I said to her, "Do you have any advice for me?" She said, "Yes, you're used to intellectual control of your material. You're used to writing critical essays, poems. As a fiction writer, particularly as a novelist, you're going to have to learn to find a passive gear where your fictive world takes over and you follow. My version of that is, how do you tell somebody's story? You have a character, you want to tell their story. You have to humble yourself to the character and let them teach you how to tell your story. This is why so many very smart people, like literary critics and English professors, can't write fiction. They're so intellectual and they have such control of intellectual things that they cannot submit to the fictive reality and let it unfold. Because that's not an intellectual thing, it's something else. It's an act of the sympathetic imagination, really trying to get down where people are, where they feel, where they fear, where they aspire, and letting them act out their stories and telling the relevant details, the significant details, and get the dialogue right. And of course, intelligence is important to that, but it's not primarily sort of intellectual intelligence or analytical intelligence, but a sympathetic intelligence. My real entry into fiction writing was learning to let the characters tell their own stories. I discovered early on that you can't tell a story in scientifically accurate dialect. It would be very hard to read if you have lots of phonetic spelling and that kind of thing. So I began to try to learn how to give the impression of dialect, but to make the story accessible to any literate reader of English. And if you look closely at Julie's story in Gap Creek, that effect is created by some double negatives, by a few phrases like, "I knowed this, I seen that," "I'd admire to do that," and by her saying, I don't talk good, or I don't know how to tell you this, and then of course she goes ahead and tells you. It's an impression, it's a flavor, and it seemed best to let Julie tell her story and to give the impression this really is a mountain woman telling her story. It's all smoke and mirrors, it's an illusion, because she gets into passages where she's going into great complexity of emotion and experience. And if you took it out of the context, it wouldn't seem realistic at all, but in the flow of the narrative, as it builds up emotionally, the reader is swept along. I'm giving away the secrets of fiction writing here, but that's the way it works. But I'm glad you asked that, because I had a terrible time making the shift from The Truest Pleasure to Gap Creek, from one grandmother to the other, in effect, because Jenny in The Truest Pleasure is much better educated. She's a mountain housewife, but she loves to read, she loves language, she loves to talk, she has great confidence in her voice, and she tells her story with great confidence. I lived so intensely with that character in that book, writing it and rewriting it, and then coming back and rewriting it, that I couldn't get out of that voice. Every time I started to write Gap Creek, it was Jenny's voice that came out. She has a big vocabulary, much bigger vocabulary than Julie. I wrote only short stories and poems for about a year. I quit writing novels, put it on the side, came to Davidson as visiting writer in January of 1998. And I think it was being back in the South for the first time in many years, hearing the idiom of Piedmont speech and mountain speech. And it just came to me one day, oh, you're trying too hard. Let this character speak in a very simple voice. And when you're in doubt, just have her say, I don't talk good. I don't know how to tell you this. Once I got the first sentence, it just unfolded. For me, I mean, it was exciting for me to see what she would say. She said, I know about my senior because I was there. And she tells the story of the death of my senior, which is the only incident in the book that really happened. My grandmother did have a younger brother named my senior who died exactly that way. And it's the hardest part of the book for readers to understand. And the reason is I didn't set it up as well as I did the rest of the book because it really happened. I'm back to that point that when you're creating something in the imagination, you control it. You know how to do it much better than when you're transcribing reality, something that actually happened. But I got so excited writing Gap Creek, I could hardly wait to get up in the morning to see what Julie would tell me. Frost said, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. So if a story doesn't move you, it's not going to move the reader. If it doesn't excite you, it's not going to excite the reader. You're the first reader, and if it doesn't seem thrilling to you, it's not going to thrill the reader. It's a good test. I mean, are you excited about this story? It's also good when you're writing a novel to ask yourself, would anybody want to read this? If that anchor woman on the show asked you what your book was about, would you be able to say something that would make people want to read it? Is it really about something that is compelling? And the compelling stories are about struggles. In the case of Julie and Hank, struggle just to survive. Gap Creek was published in the fall of 1999. When I got back to Ithaca from Davidson, I spent about 6 months revising it. I wrote it very quickly and then revised it some. It was published about a year later. It sold out its first printing. It got wonderful reviews, got rave reviews, New York Times, everywhere. Went into a second printing, a small second printing, and we thought it was a great success. I was actually about to go into a third printing. And one snowy afternoon in January of 2000, just after the new millennium started, the phone rang, and this woman said in a vaguely southern accent, "It's true what they say on the back of your book. It's the work of a master." Well, I mean, that's the way we like to hear people talk. So I said, well, thank you. And she said, no, I mean it. Your book is so detailed. It's so intense. I couldn't put it down. And I said, well, thank you. Waiting for her to introduce herself. But instead of that, she said, could I ask you a question? Now, what does my senior really die of? And I said, well, he chokes to death on worms in this terrible scene. And she said, well, I have a book club I would like for you to visit. I had decided by that point that this was somebody in Greenville or Spartanburg I had met on book tour. So I thought I'd just be diplomatic. I said, well, I'll be happy to visit your book club when I'm back in the area. And she said, well, where are you? And I said, I'm in upstate New York. And she said, oh, you're up north. I'm up north too. I'm in Chicago. And I recognized Oprah Winfrey's voice. I'd never seen her show, but I'd seen ads for her show. And that's when I said, well, you know, you have made my day. Hung up the phone and said to my wife, you won't believe who that was on the phone. That was Oprah Winfrey. And Nancy said, well, don't you think somebody's playing a trick on you? So I thought, yeah, somebody in downtown Ithaca, they're having a good laugh. Then the phone rang again, and it was the producer of the Oprah show, and she started making arrangements for me to fly out to Chicago to tape the show and to fly down here to tape an interview on Gap Creek, on the site of the story. So I began to believe it was real. When I hung up the phone, my wife said, well, how many copies do you think this will sell? Well, I'd never seen the Oprah show, but I thought it was called the Oprah Book of the Month Club, so it was like the Book of the Month Club. And a good sale on the Book of the Month Club would be like 20,000 copies. So I thought, well, maybe if we're lucky, 20,000 copies. The next day, my publisher called and said, we have to have 600,000 copies of the hardback in bookstores by next Monday. So I began to conceive of the scale of this thing. And it sold almost 1 million copies in hardback. And then went into paperback and sold at least that many in paperback. So it was a wonderful experience. I know some writers, seem skeptical about the Oprah Book Club, but I think it's a wonderful thing, and I certainly enjoyed it. And Oprah seemed to have read my book and to really understood it. She had good things to say, insightful things to say about it. Well, I was always interested in Boone. My dad thought we were related to him. His mother was a Morgan, and it turns out we probably are, actually. That Sarah Morgan, Boone's mother, had an ancestor, Llewellyn Morgan, who is apparently one of our ancestors. This is in North Wales, around Bala, in the sheep country of North Wales. But my dad just loved the figure of Daniel Boone, this romantic figure who spent his time in the wilderness. The legendary hunter and tracker, with all the witty sayings, who looked for more elbow room, and just almost the ultimate romantic figure in the American past. Great hunter, friend of Indians, marksman. About 25 years ago, I wanted to write a poem about Boone and about the meeting of Europeans with Indians, because in some ways that seemed to me then and now the great subject. These worlds colliding, mingling, learning from each other, imitating each other, killing each other. And I did a lot of research at that time, but never used it. I was never able to write a poem about Boone. But I still have the research I had done. Almost 4 years ago, my publisher said, instead of publishing a novel next time, would you like to do a nonfiction book? They were interested in publishing nonfiction. And I said, well, maybe, I'd love to try new things. And they said, well, what kind of nonfiction book would you like to do? And I said, well, maybe a biography. I love biographies. I love to read biographies. They said, who would you like to write about? And I said, well, Edgar Allan Poe or Daniel Boone. They consulted their marketing staff and publicity staff and decided that Boone would be a better seller. And immediately I was glad they said that, because I realized I did want to work on Boone. So I spent about 3 years going to archives, looking up documents. It's a great archive in Wisconsin at the State Historical Society, the Draper Collection. About 90% of the documents having to do with Daniel Boone are in Madison, Wisconsin. But there are great archives in Kentucky and Frankfort and Lexington and Louisville. It's a great archive at the University of Chicago and the Regenstein Library. It's a great archive at Chapel Hill in the North Carolina collection. It's called the Henderson Collection, the Archibald Henderson Collection. And reading, getting things online, using the Cornell Library, I did a lot of research and collected a lot of documents. But just got more and more interested in Boone and in peeling away the myth of Boone and finding the real person there. Much to my surprise, I discovered that the real person was actually more romantic and more fascinating than the legend, than the folklore. And he stands up remarkably well to scrutiny. He was a person of real character. He helped other people, he gave away things, he trusted people. What made him different from other people was that he was so generous. And that's why he lost his land and his businesses, that he wouldn't fight in court, he would not be aggressive. And if somebody came to him and said, Daniel, I'm broke, I need something, he would just open his wallet and give them money, and was usually not paid back. But I became more and more interested in his role as a great dreamer. His dream of going into the wilderness and living at peace with the Indians and hunting with the Indians. He had been adopted by the Shawnees. He learned to talk Indian, and he thought like an Indian to a great extent. And more than any white American, with the possible exception of Sam Houston, He had a remarkable rapport with Indians. They admired him. He had a great deal of influence on them, and they on him. As I proceeded with the research, I began to find a number of mistakes previous historians had made. I'll give you an example. Lyman Draper interviewed Boone's youngest son, Nathan, in Missouri in 1851, and Nathan said in the summer of 1788, Boone and his sons dug 15 tons of ginseng and put it in a keelboat and took it up to Ohio and then up to Monongahela. It got water damage when they hit a log. So when they put it on pack horses and took it over to Hagerstown, Maryland, they only got half price for it. Well, I come from a family that has dug ginseng, and I know how light it is. So I begin to think, 15 tons of ginseng? I went to the source and realized that what Nathan had said to Lyman Draper was TUNS, that is barrels. A ton can be any size. It can be a small keg or it can be a huge barrel. But to move it around and put it on a keelboat and then load it on pack horses, it was probably not that big. So what Boone actually had was 15 barrels of ginseng. Nobody else writing on Boone apparently had ever dug ginseng, so they didn't realize how light it is when it's dried. Well, I did a little more research and went to one of Boone's account books, and in the late summer of 1788, he writes, bought 15 kegs of ginseng from Captain Fagan. So they didn't dig it, they bought it from other diggers all over Kentucky. And that was really exciting. No other biographer seemed to have caught that. The last bit of research I did just as I was finishing the book was I kept asking myself, how important is the fact that Boone was a Freemason? I talked to other Boone scholars and historians, and nobody seemed interested in this. But I knew that Freemasonry was very important in the Revolutionary era. Franklin was a Freemason. Washington was a Freemason. Nathaniel Greene was a Freemason. Lafayette was a Freemason. Baron von Steuben was a Freemason. This was one of the things that knit people together in the Revolution, and it gave them a new perspective on mankind, on the brotherhood of man. And I was looking at the tombstone of Boone's father in Mocksville, North Carolina, and I saw these circles on it. There are 3 circles on it with dots in the center. A friend of mine said she thought that was Cherokee symbols. Well, I knew that Squire Boone Sr. never had anything to do with Cherokees. His son Daniel did. But I thought, could those be Masonic signs? And I went to dictionaries and encyclopedias of Masonic signs, and sure enough, it is an important Masonic sign, generally symbolizing the relation of the individual to the divine, or the soul aspiring toward heaven, if it's placed between 2 upright lines, 2 parallel lines. So obviously, the father had something to do with Freemasonry. Well, they were in Pennsylvania at the time Freemasonry was very popular, when Franklin was part of the Big Lodge in Philadelphia. Freemasonry gave people in the middle of the 18th century this vision of the brotherhood of man and a rational world, a world of the Enlightenment. It wasn't anti-Christian, it wasn't anti-religion, but it was different. And I think Boone's connection to Freemasonry gave him a vision that certainly affected the way he looked at the Indians, the way he looked at other people, the way he looked at the British. He met Freemasons among the British. He was remarkably tolerant of other people. Influenced by his Quakerism, he was raised as a Quaker. But Freemasons would initiate in the 18th century Jews, Indians. The great Mohawk chief Joseph Brant was a Freemason, for instance. And some African Americans were initiated in the lodge. So you can see what a different kind of thing this was. And it was the fresh wind, it was a part of the fresh wind sweeping Europe and Britain and America, led to the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So many people in the French Revolution were Freemasons. Voltaire was a Freemason. Helvetius was a Freemason. This was Franklin's entree into the highest levels of the French intelligentsia, and then into the government. He was able to negotiate with the French, partly because he was a Freemason. So this thing that seemed almost like nothing at first turned out to be a very big thing. That Boone was a part of that movement of the Enlightenment. But I just think it's a thrilling story. I mean, the story of, it's a paradoxical story, and ultimately it's a very sad story. That Boone, through his love of the wilderness, of hunting, and of hunting with Indians, led people into the wilderness to destroy it. In 1784, he said to John Filson, "I believe I have been an instrument of the settlement of Kentucky." At the end of his life, he says, "I believe I have been an instrument of the destruction of the Indian world and their hunting grounds." He was very sad about that at the end of his life. He said, "I could never trust a Yankee, but the Indians have never lied to me." And by Yankees, he didn't mean people of the Northeast. He meant Americans as opposed to Spanish people and French people. So it's a paradoxical story. He is one of the great heroes of American culture. He's one of the founding fathers. He opened the West more than anybody. And he came to view that as finally a tragic thing. And we are all divided in that way. You know, we have the country, and we're glad we have the country, but we know we destroyed a world of Indians, and we destroyed the wilderness. Kentucky was considered the most beautiful place in the world by the people who had seen it, the Bluegrass Island. Boone said in 1784 he had seen valleys in Ohio, the Scioto River Valley and the Little Miami River Valley, that were more beautiful than Kentucky, if that's possible. It was a land of buffalo and beaver, bluegrass. It seemed like paradise. A Baptist preacher was heard to say in 1769, "My honeys, heaven is a Kentucky of a place." Once Boone heard about Kentucky, he never was satisfied with North Carolina, the Yadkin with the Blue Ridge Mountains. He bent every effort toward reaching the bluegrass, because that was the West. And there was a sense among people of his generation that Kentucky was the key. It's the title of one of my chapters. If you could settle Kentucky, if you could reach Kentucky, the Ohio River Valley was then open. Ohio country was open, Indiana and the Illinois country, and the Mississippi Valley, reaching from Canada to New Orleans. The whole church got hot and vivid with a rush of unhuman chatter above the congregation. And I saw my father looking at the altar as though electrocuted. It was a voice I'd never heard, but knew as from other centuries. It was the voice of awful fire. "What's he saying?" Ronald hissed and jabbed my arm. "Probably Hebrew." The preacher called out another hymn, and the glissade came again. High syllables, not from my father's lips, but elsewhere, the flare of higher language, sentences of light. And we sang and sang again, but no one rose as if from sleep to be interpreter. Explained the writing on the air that still shone there, like blindness. None volunteered a gloss or translation or receiver of the message. My hands hurt when pulled from the pew's varnish they had gripped and sweated so. Later, standing under the high and plain-sung pines on the mountain, I clenched my jaws like pliers, holding in and savoring the gift of silence.